Hello and welcome to the Irth podcast. I'm your host, Jason Adams. Today, I'm excited to introduce two exceptional figures in the technology sector as our guest. Justin Oliveira is the founder and CEO of Boston Geospatial, a geospatial intelligence company that helps businesses identify and measure their exposure to natural perils. Previously, he was the founder of satellite data relay company Hedron, formerly Analytical Space, spent close to a decade at NASA as a technologist and engineer, and even worked at the White House on civilian space and technology policy. Justin holds a BS and MS in aerospace engineering from the Florida Institute of Technology and an MBA from the Harvard Business School. Also joining us today is Matthew Abbitt. Matt has a strong background in helping software companies grow and thrive through product management practices and strategy. Previously working in the startup world, Matthew has led product at 3 different companies. With a passion for education, he holds a bachelor's degree in chemistry, a mini MBA from Miami University, and a Juris Doctor degree from William Howard Taft University. In 2013, he even authored Start Predicting in a World of Data Science and Predictive Analysis. As a chief product officer at Irth, he leads the team responsible for designing and executing Irth's vision and strategy. Our discussion today is focusing on pipeline integrity and how leveraging modern technologies is keeping the world safer. So I want to kind of start the conversation today, and Justin, I'm going to start with you. Can you explain what constitutes a natural disaster and pipeline integrity, particularly focusing on geohazards and why they are significant?
Sure. Thanks. So natural threats, including geotechnical ones or geohazards, as they're often referred to, really pose a significant risk to the integrity of pipelines. So these threats, just to kind of mention them really quickly, include things like weather conditions like floods, hurricanes, freeze-thaw cycles, or geological events like in processes like landslides, earthquakes, river erosion, sinkholes. They're significant because they can really lead to pipe deformation, ruptures, or even failures. And that's really the main focus here, is that these hazards, whether they are geohazards or other sort of weather and outside force effects, can impart stresses and strains on the pipes that can cause failures to the welds, failures to equipment. And important to note too is that even in extreme weather conditions like flooding and hurricanes, they can exacerbate geohazards. So things like landslides can be exacerbated, can be accelerated because of these things. So
Interesting. Matt, I know we spent a lot of time working in the damage prevention sector where we look at current construction, but now we're actually trying to identify new threats to the facilities. I'm kind of curious, how significant are these natural threats to the safety, the integrity of the pipeline across the country?
Yeah, and I love that question. When you think about it, a single threat is significant by itself, but then when you pair multiple on top of each other, now you can see a different threat profile across the board, right, for a single place. So when you think about that, like to piggyback off what Justin's saying here, let's say that we have a slope that's a really steep slope right here, but then you've also got a bunch of soil moisture on that slope. Then the next day you see a methane deposit using satellite imagery. That could be an issue right here. You could have had a slide that caused an actual caused the pipe to actually break here. So they are significant. They happen all the time, right? It's happening more frequently and more often, especially with the weather event side. But same thing, right? When you pair seismic, you pair the slopes, the fire, all those things related, along with the 811 tickets, which are another important variable because now that's a digging activity, breaking the actual ground dirt here. Those are significant to this.
Interesting.
Yeah, just to add to that too, just to look at, if you just look at the PHMSA data alone around earth movement, right? So that's considered a geohazard. That include things like landslides, sinkholes, just settlement of the land. The average incident from an earth movement is around $4 to $5 million of direct damage just to the pipeline. That's right from the PHMSA database. That excludes lost revenue. That excludes indirect damages to the impacted area, the legal and regulatory fines. When you add all those things up, you're talking $10-15 million on average for an incident. And that doesn't include downstream of that, when the regulators come in, consent decrees that are now going to heighten the bar for you around what you have to do, the monitoring you have to do, that's above and beyond maybe what you would have had to have done just by, looking purely at the reg itself. So, the pretty significant cost. And then, of course, the downstream effects too are really, really large to a business. So
yeah, Justin, it's interesting. I guess For our audience, I'm curious if you could maybe kind of tell us about maybe any examples of this kind of threats to the pipeline integrity that you've seen recently.
Sure. So I think the best thing is PHMSA actually issued in mid 2019, and then in mid 22, they issued a notice around geohazards. And in both of those, they highlighted several case studies, and then of course use those notices to kind of start a dialogue around best practices and things like that. So one of the cases I like to highlight there, because in hindsight it was easy to see coming, was the 2020 failure of Denbury's CO2 pipeline in Yazoo County, Mississippi, due to a landslide. So that incident, there was a CO2 liquid carbon dioxide pipeline that was going underneath a state highway. The release, the landslide happened. There was a release about 30,000 barrels of liquid carbon dioxide immediately released and then vaporized into the atmosphere. The slope that failed was a really steep embankment along this state highway. So sort of weather aside, this slope was particularly at risk due to just the grade and the soil type. But when you start kind of factoring in, well, heavy rains were really kind of believed to be the root cause of that. The rains happen, the soil moisture builds up in the slope, the ability for the slope to kind of hold and retain itself degrades over time. It fails. So when it fails, it displaces along the pipe. It creates an axial strain, and that ruptured a girth weld. I think it is what happened. So if we actually go back and we look seasonally in the years leading up to the incident, traditionally in Mississippi, the rainy times of the year are sort of like the late fall through the winter. So if we go back though in the months leading up to that incident, the soil moisture was much higher than average, at a much higher level than average. And then so you factor that in with a slope and a soil type that was already at risk, and we could have really easily seen early on, if we had these sort of tools that we have now, to look and do assessments, we would have seen these things coming. These are things we can screen for in the slope risk application in Irth, for example. So that's just one really good example. I always use that example because it's fairly recent, and it highlights an instance where we could have been really helpful. So.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, just the idea of how much data there is, because what we are literally talking about is looking at where anywhere there's a facility line is having all the data around it, from soil, slope, weather, everything that you can possibly imagine. It seems like an unlimited amount of data. But it's interesting, as you kind of explained, the predictive ability of that data is so valuable, and how we leverage that. I guess, Matt, as we kind of move forward, we look at the technological landscape. It's changed quite a lot lately. And I guess, what's the impact has that had on pipeline safety? And how can we kind of leverage all of this new data and information to really make better decisions for our safety?
Yeah. When you think about that, I mean, it's changed for multiple reasons. I mean, when you look at it, there's really two kind of drivers of that. So you do have weather patterns changing, right? You do have more extremes kind of coming up and down, and also in different areas of the country now, different regional geographic areas are seeing some different things as well. Then you focus that or drive that along or correlate it with actually demand being up in certain cases, across the sectors, right? So those two things there create that as a focus. Now, what you look at is when you know that you have weather changing patterns in high demand for these different products. Now you look around the landscape to say, well, how did they used to do that? Well, there's multiple ways that we used to do that and gather that data to figure out what's going on, right? A lot of it was manual. Manual then has moved now to on cars, to LiDAR on planes, and now there is a big shift now where we can get a lot of this scope across an entire pipeline and see that from a satellite using different types of tools, different algorithms on a satellite here to detect what those changes are here. So that's really where it is, and that data is it's out there, it's accessible, but it right now is in many different kind of silos or many different spots here. So that's what we're really seeing.
Yeah, it's interesting. Justin, your thoughts on this now with all of this data? I mean, this plays directly into your background. I don't know if there's anyone more qualified to sit here and kind of have a really good explanation, but see how that works through this whole process. I'm kind of curious what you see now with all of this data and how we can leverage it better.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So I think, as Matt mentioned, remote sensing platforms. So that can include aerial platforms, but space in particular, I think has a unique advantage because of the amount of area it can cover, the types of sensors, and in a lot of cases, like at Boston Geospatial, we focus a lot on satellite radar data. Satellite radar data has a great advantage over electro-optical, and in many cases, lidar. One of the main advantages is the fact that it can operate at night and through clouds and different, poor weather conditions. Whereas, getting a plane up to fly an instrument or take images, even on a satellite with the camera through clouds, is very difficult, in most cases impossible, right? So through technologies like synthetic aperture radar, in processing synthetic aperture radar imagery with a method called interferometry, we can look at really small changes to the terrain over time and understand how those might relate to geohazards along infrastructure, whether that's a pipeline, a road, a facility. And then we can, relate that to risk. We can relate that even in a lot of cases, which is, I think, an area we'll talk about in a second that we focus quite a bit on actually contextualizing the data into tangible things that operators care about and speak on a daily basis about. So things like strain, right? What is my strain capacity of this pipeline? What is this evolving threat? How much stress is that creating when you compare it to my design stress, right? Or my allowable stress that I would design the pipeline to, right? So that's a big area. I think, radar. The other is digital twinning. So the idea of sort of taking not just one data set, but multiple data sets, combining them together to create a sort of synthetic, semi, augmented perspective of what's going on. So a really good example of that is the stuff we do with slope, right? We take LiDAR data or other terrain models that might come from satellite radar, for example. We combine that with soil and meteorological data to develop these sort of first order, kind of second order models of what is the susceptibility of the slope, what is the risk, how susceptible is the slope to a landslide, to failing, right? And then from that, we can then inform decisions. We can score and risk. We can score total risk for an asset. So I think that's a second area. And then the third area really is kind of a combination of all those, which is really kind of fusing together these geospatial technologies, which is really what the two former were, with engineering and design analysis, right? So one thing we focused on a lot here at Boston Geospatial, beyond being kind of experts at remote sensing, processing remote sensing data into these insights, is then relating it to engineering parameters. So, for example, taking that measurement of how the ground's moving around a pipeline and then relating it to and actually estimating those things like strain and stress. That's kind of a third area of innovation that we've focused a lot on, and we think that really kind of helps contextualize all this technology, this data, and make it useful, right? I think that's been the real gap. One of the big real gaps in the industry and in the market has been there's all this data, there's all this technology, there's all these vendors you can go to that will take these measurements for you, but how do you operationalize it, right? How do you take it and sort of stratify and condense it down into something that someone can look at on a a page, a slide, a piece of paper, and then make a decision, right? And that's been a gap. And so I think we're really moving the needle, trying to fill that gap, through the partnership that we have together and the work we're doing, getting all these capabilities and applications in the Irth platform. I think really is going to help operators a lot move that needle in terms of managing their risk and also being efficient with their assets, right? So
Yeah. It seems to me that with all of this new data, that also invites the opportunity for regulation, right? We're getting more predictive information, but there's so much out there now. So organizations that kind of really manage this, like PHMSA, for example, is really increasing its focus on geotechnical hazards. Can you kind of explain the reason behind the heightened attention? And is that directly related to now having access to more data, or why has that come about?
Yeah. And
Yeah, go ahead, Matt. Yeah.
yeah, I'll take the top part of that. So when I look at it, it's one of the things is just straight up because of damages, right? So when they look at it, they do look at damages. In 2021, they added some additional like gathering lines. Now is regulated pipeline, and it was due because of damages, right? So if you do have damages on pipeline, that will drive regulations up. But other reasons are literally for really for trying to reduce that, but also trying to meet the demand and make sure there's not a disruption demand from a macro standpoint as well, right? So it does come down to that. It comes down to safety, but the data around it is important to basically help drive those things down, help drive the actual damages down, and help increase the safety at the end of the day. And then I know there's a lot of other rules. We're still working on the MAGO gas rule here. That is a big focus. I mean, Justin, you know a lot more about the PHMSA regulations here, so I'll let you kind of take over from here.
Yeah, no, I think, generally, right, the rhyme is safety, right? I also think a degree of it too is like kind of stewardship of the land, right? But I think the reason really is the frequency of incidents tied to these things, the geohazards and other, sort of weather and outside force effects have increased. And sort of PHMSA sort of blanket covers, and they do a good job too in the notice of covering all different types of geohazards, right? Anything that's like gonna create excess strain on the pipe. So this can be like, again, landslides, subsidence, sinkholes, faulting, right? Faulting's like a fault line and it moves, like, and then typically when that happens is an earthquake, seismicity. So I think, we talked earlier about, the increase of these things but the frequency is increasing. The other really big factor too is like the age of the assets are getting really old. I think the last time I looked, the average age of a pipeline, at least in the US, is like older than 50 years old. Like that's really old. So you think about like, there's these the frequency of these events is increasing because there's some shift in patterns going on with regard to rainfall and precipitation, wind, things like that. But there's also this other factor of like they've been in the ground for 50 years, right? There's been improvements they've made. They've replaced certain sections, but they weren't put in the ground like 5-10 years ago. A lot of these pipelines, the average pipeline is not 5 or 10 years old, right? So that's another big factor I think too is time, right? A lot of these things like geohazards, they take time to play out. They don't happen necessarily all the time in a few years. They take, in many cases, they can take tens, in some cases, hundreds of years to play out, right? But the longer the thing's in the ground, the higher the likelihood is you're going to be exposed to them, right? So I think, again, I think the frequency of the events is picking up, the age. I also think too, there's been, generally a big, there's been a lot of, operators have invested a lot in, because of regulatory requirements, they've invested a lot in ILI, inline inspection programs, aerial patrolling, data models and record systems, right? I also think to a certain degree, there's maybe like a natural progression here of like, all right, we have these investments that the industry is now coming up and we're normalizing, right? The next piece is like, let's start to use data and other technologies to help bring all that together into sort of, one nexus and use it to make, better decisions, right? Do more risk-based prioritization, like use all this data and these technologies together to make, better decisions around where and what we build and things like that. I think, that's a factor too. So, there's a little bit of, I think, the failures are increasing, but I think also a little bit too is like trying to kind of push the state of the art, try to move the standard a little forward too in the industry, maybe. I mean, that's just my perspective, but I think a certainty is like, the frequency is increasing, right? So we have to do something about it, right?
Yeah, it's interesting as you say that, because one of the things that strikes me here is, Matt, our relationship with Geospatial, a partnership that we have, gives us some opportunities to really look at solutions for this space. So I'm kind of curious, what technologies are we kind of leveraging now? What offerings can we do inside, whether it's our product or what other technologies exist today, to really leverage this information? And I think more importantly, help make critical decisions off of this information, right? So can you kind of give us some insight on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where this is where I love the story and the partnership that we have here. What we really were focused on originally at Earth was getting the data from the field users. Field techs go on site, we collect the data from them. Then we kind of shifted that over, just to mention air patrols, right, to different types of user groups, to to planes, pilots in the plane, to even getting LiDAR eventually off of the planes. And those things have a tremendous cost to them, right? They're very costly. Meanwhile, in the industry, from like a macro standpoint, you have space, which Justin talked about with satellites, and you have the imagery in space actually becoming cheaper, but the quality of the image is actually increasing along with the different types of instruments on those satellites, right? Where we can see different types of things, like Justin mentioned the INSAR. Along with that, now you can actually use algorithms to determine things from a satellite that's on the ground. And so looking at that, we realized that you can take a look at that data and you can look at those things like we're talking about: methane, seismic, slope, fire, soil moisture, all from a very large cover standpoint, right? And not only can you do that now, but you can use a single platform to bring that data together in one. And then the big thing on top of that is, now when that data is aggregated, now you can create a risk profile along a particular asset. And that's the big thing, right? So it's taking all this data from a cover standpoint and then creating a risk profile where they can see specific plots along the pipeline where they have the most risk because of these different geohazards, right? Because of a seismic activity paired with a bad slope, right? Or any type of thing like that, weather paired with something that's a high slope of soil moisture, right? So that's really where we're really focusing on the futures in those algorithms, in that full coverage, and bringing the data together and creating that risk profile.
Yeah,
I
just
think
to add to that, when Boston Geospatial was kind of created, when we sort of started in sort of early 2020, when my co-founder Sina and I launched the company, our real focus was like, we saw early on, like as early as 2018, 2019, like, hey, there's this real gap in the specific, in particular in the energy market, but wider to critical infrastructure, where like natural threats, geotechnical threats, there's just a real solutions gap. And we really think we can make a difference there as kind of experts in space and remote sensing, right? But I think the reason why our partnership works so well is that where we sort of lack is the ability to relate that all to, and have the insight into the user interface and the ticket management and all the work items and all of that part of in the very important part of the value creation of like creating these solutions is like the delivery, right? So I think that's a key piece of it. I think that, and I think so for operators to be able to consume this intelligence that we can create and have as an application within Earth, in a familiar platform like Earth, I think it really unlocks a lot of value and really helps them, very quickly understand how things relate to their assets, how they relate to work orders, tickets, and more importantly, I think, is so that everybody in the organization can benefit, right? It's not like the geohazard guy getting the information, like everybody that's in the system that's like, hey, I have a dig ticket, or hey, I'm doing a work at this site. You can also see attached to it like all these risks profiles that like you normally wouldn't see because everything's so siloed in the organization. Now you can all see it, right? That creates a huge amount of value. So really excited about that, and I think that's going to be a really big enabler here for the industry going forward, is taking these sort of disparate sources of data and information, bringing them together and making them valuable for everybody, not just the integrity guy who got, tossed being the geohazard lead, right?
right.
Everybody can benefit from it. So
Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, in my course of time in the industry, watching how we went from like fax machines to where we are now, we're using AI to do predictive risk, is just blows me away because it's been such a short period of time. But Justin, you hit on something that I think is so absolutely critical. It's getting the right information into the right hands, but not realizing probably before today that that information does have value to this other group as well. So when you could see the challenges that we're doing with pipeline integrity, we're identifying risky areas and all that. When you combine that with construction, we get more eyes on site. So now we actually have people doing that. Just having a desktop, I think, as an operator today, when you could look at and see all the different factors of risk and slope and all of these different things under one roof, that tells me that data is all falling into a bucket that has familiarity, which I think only has a ton of benefits for the end owner of the facility line, because now they're getting a much greater, I think, glossary of all the information around that asset than they've ever had before. And as you were saying, to do it in a way that's built in, one of the reasons that we love Irth is that we talk to a really great audience. What we now find is that audience wants more information, and this gives us the ability to distribute it to them. I'm blown away by some of the real-time aspects of this. To me, this would seem like I go do a bunch of work, I come back with a lot of data, 3 months later, the GIS group gets it, 6 months later, they can. That isn't what's going on here. What's happening is in real time, you're able to use satellite imagery to predict possible challenges around the facility, and who's more appropriately to handle that than the guys that are out there working in the construction area. So it's such a great partnership. It kind of opens the door to new opportunities. I'm curious, we have all of this. What's the next step, Justin? What in your world is groundbreaking? Because the stuff that you probably do today, I can't imagine the pipelines can even try to implement some of those processes, but how do we say what's coming in the future so we can get them prepared to do that?
Well, I think you brought a really good point up, which we didn't even talk about, which is the potential in the short to medium term going forward to create feedback loops, right? So one of the things I thought was really interesting in the PHMSA notice, it might have been maybe just specific to the 2022 amended one, was they actually call out, they say, in effect, they reference that patrol programs in basically have a responsibility to look for geohazards, which I find funny because a lot of times geohazards are really difficult, to see. But I think it brings up an interesting point that if you have a common platform where you're managing more than just one facet of your risk management initiative, you have dig tickets, work items, you have this risk data. If you have one kind of platform where you're doing all this in, we could create these interesting feedback loops where, if we knew, for example, there's a particular slope or several slopes along a right of way where there's potential risk for failure, like why not annotate that? And when your patrollers schedule their patrol flights, hey, like, when you go fly over the slope, can you do an extra low pass over it and tell me if you see any signs of potential failure, right? So these are the type of feedback loops that aren't, I think, automatically happening. They're maybe manually happening in very narrow instances, but at scale, those could happen everywhere, right? It's creating these feedback loops within the system. I think that's a real big opportunity. But I think, generally speaking, we talked about, I think there's certainly different, innovations on the horizon that I think could, be beneficial in the next 5 or 10 years in the industry. There's a lot of buzz and focus right now, of course, on AI and, in particular, generative AI. And I think recommendation engines is a huge area in geospatial that is still people are trying to figure out how do we use these innovations in, things like not computer vision and object detection, but actually recommendations, like using generative to do recommendations. I think that's still, people are trying to figure that out, but I think that might be the biggest area of value in the next 5 or 10 years in this specific vertical of sort of pipeline and integrity management is recommendations, right? I think I've identified these risky areas. What do I do, right? Because and the reason why I think it's valuable is because there's many different facets at play. It's not a linear thing, just a technical. There's business decisions around it. There's public relations around it. There's regulatory compliance around it. So I think having that type of technology, be able to take all these different facets together and offer you, recommendations that sort of balance those priorities and balance those mandates could be really powerful. But I think just in general, these technologies we've already talked about, satellite radar, digital twinning, near real-time alerts, all these things that we've developed and deployed as applications within the Irth platform. I think there's a good, few years here of an adoption curve for the industry. And I think it's still very early. So I think is the big focus here for the next 5 years is let's get everybody up the adoption curve to that. And then, because we need to do that before we can talk about how do we now wrap around all that a generative AI recommendation engine, right? We need to first get up to that level first before we can have that sort of conversation, I feel like, as an industry, right?
And let me piggyback off that a little bit, because I agree with you. And I look at two things, right? There's a short term and a long term. And basically, in the short term, we have to take a very complex set of data to make it very easy for the end user, right? Which is really what we've done at this point. When a regulator is taught to walk up to a map and point to a piece of pipe on a map and say, what are all your risks here? We've got to take everything with that satellite imagery, all that risk profile, and put it into an easy view, right? And that's where we are today, right? We're even further than that today, where we're creating that risk profile. But that next iteration of that is really a hands-off, where as we determine more variables that can impact and more geohazards that can impact what's actually happening with a pipeline or an asset, and now we can get more profiles along those. Now, to Justin's point, we can automate, predict the next action, right? People can be hands-off, not actually view the information, but alerts pop out automatically and say, you need to go take a look at this particular section of pipeline, right? And then if we compare that with things like large language models, we can make the readings more understandable and the things more understandable that we do. But really, the utopia is getting to a point where you've got satellite imagery taking, you've got algorithms on top of it, you've got AI really looking at the imagery as well to detect issues or changes. And then you've got kind of like large language models that all spit it out in a nice risk profile that say, hey, here's your biggest risk. You need to go look at this right now. And that all happens in real time. So that's where we're headed.
Yeah, I think it's one of the interesting things. You guys alluded to it a little. The affordability of this now is just really kind of opened the door for opportunity, right? We always see that. There's always a barrier to entry, especially with cost and gathering data. But it seems to me like the cost of data is going down. That affects this. That then brings the motivation to do more with it to the table. I guess, Matt, as we kind of wind this down, I'm curious, I'll let you go first. Some of the highlights that you're looking forward in the next, 6 to 12 months of what you see going on and how our partnership with Geospatial is going to be beneficial to our clients. And then, Justin, I'll kind of let you finish it up and really looking forward to these answers.
Yeah. And for me, I mean, it's one of the areas where I'm the most excited about because it really is cutting edge, right? And when you think about it, we're constantly looking, like with our partners with Boston Geospatial here. What are the changes, the different hardware that are going to be added to the satellites? What's the imagery look like, right? How good of a quality can we get along with cost as well? And so we do see that becoming much more available across the board. So we are at a point now where we can actually cover a very large area, right, at a very minimal cost. So you've got the economic factor right there, which makes it viable now in the market. It makes customers have a return on investment in what they're getting. To pair that, what you're also having along with that is you get the ability now to really prioritize where your risks are, where you're going to send people, right? So before I'd have them, cover the entire pipeline, with patrols, and they still have to do that with the Aero Patrol as well. But now I can see that risk profile, see exact spots along the pipeline that is a main focus point to get to here, right? And when you have that, and you can sort by methane. I see methane on the ground. What's our actual leak rate of methane paired with things like a seismic activity that just happened? And so for us, we're really working with Boston Geospatial on what additional variables can we add, right? And then adding those into a particular risk profile here. And that's going to be driven by hardware. The better the satellites, the better the hardware, the better our the data can get on their side, the better algorithms we can produce on our side to create that profile. And then really then start tapping into a little bit more of AI to create more of that automation. That's where this is really going here. And Justin, you get
Yeah, I think what I'm most excited about is sort of the ability moving towards this sort of long-term kind of, I think, vision of I think that's been kind of set for a while, which is like this idea of risk-based prioritization and actually having these tools and these technologies available at your fingertip to do all these different things, not just do your baseline assessment plan to fulfill your compliance requirement, not just to kind of drive your integrity management plan, but to also like use it for capital planning, right? Like, and actually have a return on investment that's not just in your operating expense column, it's also in your capital expenditures column too, right? Like, I think that's really powerful. And I think if you fast forward a year, maybe even, less than a year from now, I think with the work that we're doing, people are going to start to be able to see those those investments and see those returns really quickly. I think in general trends I see, that are really exciting. Um, there's a rapid expansion of the number of these different satellite platforms in space. Um, whether it's hyperspectral, constellations that are going up, that are going to allow for more accurate and more detailed look at things like methane leak, right? And be able to have a higher coverage too, so we can catch these things earlier, right? More radar satellites that are operating in at finer resolutions that have the ability to more ad hoc be tasked, in rapidly respond to evolving weather conditions and disasters and incidents as they happen. Those are now becoming, you would think like, oh, it's the space industry. Like we can rapidly task all these satellites and put them on a target and look what's going on. Not really the case up until maybe 3 or 4 years ago, at least in the commercial market. And you're seeing players like Umbra, the amount of volume of satellites going up with operators like ICEYE and Capella. And there's this sort of huge now availability of this radar data, in particular, multispectral, hyperspectral satellites that are really going to add to both the sort of collapse of the cost, which is good, but are really, I think, more importantly, open up the use cases, right? I think that's been a big area where a lot of these problems, these sort of use cases in critical infrastructure have been limited by not enough data, not a high enough revisit rate. The cost has been really, really, really high. And then the sensors have been kind of crappy or like not good enough. And that's collapsing and improving really quickly, right? And that's going to open up all these use cases like we didn't talk about, right? So, how do we apply some of the radar, capabilities to looking at things like change of terrain over, areas where you're worried about depth of cover, right? How do we look at, potentially how, settlement and erosion's happening around, river crossings and things like that, right? That's going to be enabled by these very high resolution radar satellites that we really didn't have commercially, 3-4 years ago, but we have now. So I think that's going to open up some really cool use cases that are going to really have a really good return on investment here in the short term. So it's a lot of exciting things happening in remote sensing, in geospatial, on the hardware side and the algorithm and software side that I think, if we can figure out how to commercialize them, which I think we will, are going to be really great for the industry. So.
Yeah, obviously, I mean, it's the tip of the iceberg here. I mean, we're just beginning to see what's capable, and it's fun to have partners now that we're working together to say, hey, this is what we have, this is what you have. Because of this is just the first of many of these conversations. Matt and Justin will be hosting a webinar on March 12th. So please tune in to this link and you'll find out more information of it. I think this conversation is outstanding. I really want to have more and more of these. I'm realizing how much I don't know about this space. And I think for our clients specifically, learning about this, especially what we see what pipelines are doing, usually tends to flow down through the rest of our utility members in some sort of fashion, the lessons that we learned from here. So I'm really excited about this. I want to thank you both for spending time with me today. I think this was a very enlightening conversation. I really am going to tune into your webinar when that goes off, because I think it's going to be a great continuation of this conversation. And I hope we can do this again. It's amazing. I think what we should set a marker and say, let's look in 12 months. Let's go back and revisit to see where we've come, what we've deployed, and to kind of fine tune this final point, what Justin said, get that feedback loop, because now we don't know what we don't know. We're just learning today. So I'm so excited of what we could do together to really add value to this really unique challenge that's facing our pipelines. So thank you both very much. And this is Jason Adams signing off on the Irth podcast until we do this again.